Given what kind of audience I presume I have, I'd be willing to bet that nearly everyone watching this has a favorite kind of ship or ship type. Mine's the USS Enterprise, because when I was a kid, Battle 360 hit me like crack. But this extends to fiction too, because eventually the kind of person who memorizes tanks will realize there are only so many real-life tanks to memorize. Warhammer has plenty of awesome ships, from the sleek vessels of the Eldar to the almighty gunbricks of the Imperium, and the Necron croissants for those of you with more eccentric tastes. Over in Halo, we have damn near every ship, to be honest. The Human Covenant War was the most destructive competition of who could have the coolest ship designs and names in history. Long Night of Solace, Pillar of Autumn, Pure Heat. But at the end of the day, there's always one setting most people think of when it comes to awesome space battles and spaceships: Star Wars. You know damn well that an Imperial Star Destroyer is the most iconic ship ever made. Don't pretend otherwise. The pizza slice of doom is awesome. But I'd argue, it's not the best. Before there was the Empire, there was the Republic, and before the Imperial Star Destroyer, there were so many other kinds that in my humble opinion have so much more sauce. Mostly the Clone Wars era stuff because I was a kid in the 2000s, but I'll mention the older stuff too, don't you worry KOTOR fans. So let's talk about the Republic Navy today, because every time I see a Venator I get a raging stiffy and I'm making it all of your problem. But before I begin, are you watching this video in bed? Would you like to perhaps make your bed a bit more comfortable? Because you can with Helix, the sponsor of this video. Helix makes premium mattresses with high quality materials customized to suit your sleeping needs. Soft, firm, and everything in between, you will find something for your sleeping needs from their catalog of over 20 unique mattresses. And with spring finally here, now's a good time to get some spring cleaning done, including throwing out that old mattress. Why settle for one with stains and bedbugs when you can get yourself a brand new Helix one, custom suited to your needs? Speaking of, it couldn't be easier to figure out what you need for your mattress. All you gotta do is take the Helix Sleep Quiz, which will take you 2 minutes tops, and it'll match you with a perfect mattress. I've got the Helix Midnight Lux, and this bad boy's a masterful mattress. Never slept better since I got this thing. Don't just take my word for it though. 82% of participants saw an increase in sleep quality in Helix's Wesper sleep study, with on average 25 minutes longer of deep sleep and 39 minutes more sleep overall. And if that isn't enough for you, there's a 120-day sleep trial to make sure it's right for you. Plenty of time to ensure you've got the mattress just for what you need, and there's a lifetime warranty on top of it. To get yourself the finest of mattresses around, look no further. Head to helixsleep.com/pancreasnowork or the link in the description and pinned comment to get yourself 27% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/pancreasnowork or the link in the description and pinned comment for 27% off site-wide. You spend a third of your life asleep, so how about you get yourself a Helix mattress to make sure you rest your best. Now then, time to give 20 million credits to Kuat Drive Yards. I'll try not to spend too long here, both because I have a biological need to talk about Venators and because Old Republic lore scares me a bit. Mostly because while I feel I know at least a decent bit of it, I don't like MMOs, and be it online or the friends I know in real life, everyone I've spoken to who's played Star Wars The Old Republic is at least a little bit psychopathic, and I'm afraid they'll wear my skin if I mess up the lore at all. Incidentally, if you ever saw one particular asshole buying the entirety of a new item and reselling it on the in-game stock market for quintuple the price, I might know that guy. It's funny to hear about him doing that. Anyways, the Old Navy. The Republic, when it first formed over 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, BBY, didn't have a navy. In fact, it would go through periods like this, where it would have a navy and then wouldn't. Initially, it didn't have one because of a fear that the particularly powerful core worlds of the galaxy would use the, in theory, Republic Navy to bully outlying planets, which, damn, it's nice to see that even in Star Wars, history runs in cycles. About 1,000 years later, during a war against people that, I'll just be frank with you, are not Sith and therefore not really worth worrying too much about, it did finally create a proper navy that was in some ways almost feudal in nature. While it was properly centralized and headquartered on the planet of Forest, the then largest shipyard available, every planet was required to send a certain amount of manpower and resources to contribute, rather than something like budget being allocated for naval armament. It disbanded another 100 years later anyways, and in spite of a large amount of conflicts happening, it would be almost 10,000 years and 15,000 BBY when the Republic finally got itself a proper navy again. It did keep up a decent naval tradition and number of ships, however, as individual planets were in charge of defending themselves by and large, and so you could still find experienced officers and admirals if the Republic really needed a coalition of ships thrown together. For the second go-around of the Navy, it was mostly defensive in nature. Battleships and other heavy vessels would largely guard the core worlds, while corvettes, destroyers, and other smaller ships would perform what often amounted to glorified raids on any enemies that might crop up. With its headquarters now being on Coruscant this time, we've got the first time the Senate and Supreme Chancellor gave up and just plopped everything in the middle of the core worlds as far as the military goes. But in fairness, having everything properly coordinated and centralized like that isn't inherently awful. As long as, say, the Supreme Chancellor doesn't ride a wave of religious fervor into crusades into the Outer Rim, there shouldn't be any major issues with the Navy being based out of Coruscant. And then one Supreme Chancellor asked himself, what if I was the Emperor of Mankind? And what if the Republic cosplayed as the Imperium for a bit? The Pius Dia era was weird. It was very weird. Mostly because this 40k ass era jumps at you in Star Wars, and it feels very non-standard for Star Wars, at least for me. TLDR, a human-centric religion spread like wildfire across the Republic for a bit that taught that mankind is the best, and you have a religious duty to get rich by invading the outer worlds, especially alien majority ones. The Navy during this time was of course the way these crusades were launched, with thousands and thousands of planets being forcefully converted. Some aliens were considered fine if they were useful enough, and planets were allowed to retain autonomy, but if you wanted to freely move about the galaxy, you had to join the Navy if you were one of these conquered peoples. The Republic for a bit had outright 40k-style cathedral ships crewed by people who descended from the original crew. What the hell happened here? Genuinely, did a writer for Star Wars Legends read way too many 40k books and just went rogue? Eventually, the Republican Navy was de-icked of all this nonsense, but what even happened here with this? The Sith weren't even involved, I don't think. Everyone went mad for a bit on their own volition. Throughout this entire time period, though I've not said it much, the Jedi naturally worked close in combination with either the official Navy or whatever unofficial version of it the Republic had throughout the eras. They had a few moments where the Sith tried some stuff, as they did, so the Navy and Jedi, especially during those moments, worked closely together with each other. After Pius Dia, when it was still around, it had even gained a sizable amount of autonomy for itself. The Navy could freely move on request of someone to stabilize a region if unrest or extreme piracy was plaguing an area, though if the action was to take more than a week, it did require senatorial approval. The Mandalorian Wars also naturally saw heavy use of the Republic Navy. Those of you who played KOTOR know how they went. The Republic in space and on the ground was getting absolutely bodied by Mandos before Revan and Malak did some funny things and convinced a bunch of Jedi to throw themselves into the conflict and push back the Mandalorians. This far back is even the point the first proto-ancestors of Star Destroyers emerged, such as the Interdictor ship. Yeah, this evil-looking thing was originally a Republic design. Speaking of, however, then the Jedi version of the Horus Heresy happened.
Wipe this pathetic planet from the face of the galaxy.
The newly christened Darths Revan and Malak returned from their ventures into the unknown a whole lot eviler with a whole lot of Sith troopers and ships they didn't have before. The story of KOTOR is well known and not entirely relevant, so I won't talk about it much here, but the Republic Navy, in what I would consider perhaps the first time in its history, had to contend with forced nonsense it didn't have much of an answer for. While fighting the Sith by this point wasn't a brand new thing, the endless dark side-induced production capabilities of the Starforge meant that Revan and Malak could afford to drown the Republic Navy in untold amounts of spacecraft at every chance. The Republic swiftly found itself outnumbered, outgunned, and oftentimes out-space-magicked if Revan himself was leading the charge, or Malak later on. As you might also know, this essentially led to two outcomes of a fight. If Bastila is there and using her battle meditation, the Republic could eke out a win. If she wasn't, whole lot of destroyed hammerheads was in the Navy's future. But something, Darth Revan is the player character, Starforge explodes, the Jedi Civil War ends with Malak's death, and Revan... No, I'm not looking at SWTOR any more than I have to. You can't make me. The return of the Sith with the Sith Empire was a hard point for the Republic, and it was featured in an MMO, so that's even worse, but the Navy itself could proudly say they were responsible for the first major victory against the Sith at the Battle of Bathoui. Most of this is fairly background stuff because it's all MMO lore, but the Republic Navy valiantly fought back against the dark side in the largest conflict the galaxy had yet seen. Jumping ahead a mere few 10,000 years, give or take another few thousand, we come to 1000 BBY. After one last time beating down the Sith with lightsaber and battleship alike, the Navy, alongside pretty much everything resembling a military in the Republic, was heavily reorganized and reduced during the Ruusan Reformation. While I believe in canon nowadays it was once again done away with entirely, in Legends it was technically still around in the capacity of dealing with pirates, exploring the galaxy, and maybe the occasional campaign into a single system tops if someone really pissed off the Senate. There was the Republic Defense Coalition in current canon, however, which in practice is the same thing everything, even down to the judiciary controlling it. The end result in both cases, however, was that the Republic found itself once again without much of a navy. The specifics on how that looks are just a bit different. There were the occasional attempts to get a navy going every now and again, the most prominent of which was the Legends Katana fleet, also known as the Dark Force fleet. Unfortunately, the entirety of the fleet was infected with a dormant virus that when it awoke drove them all insane and they jumped randomly into hyperspace. No one found it until the Empire was a thing, and even then, nothing substantial happened with it until the New Republic of Legends was a thing. As far as the matter goes, its significance ends here. Journalists did make fun of the name Dark Force, however, which is funny to imagine that shitty Disney one-liners are apparently canon to Star Wars in-universe journalists. I'm willing to bet at least one headline read "They die now" or something like that. This lack of a navy led to problems, one of which is immediate and one of which occurred when a bunch of bureaucrats had a realization. The first and immediate problem is that these reduced defensive fleets that may or may not actually count as a navy were great at keeping the core worlds and the inner parts of the mid-rim safe. Pirates weren't exactly blitzing Coruscant on the daily. The farther you went from Coruscant, however, the more rampant such problems were, and planets far out in the Outer Rim were essentially left to fend for themselves. Some Outer Rim worlds could likely do that, if only because statistically a few of them did end up wealthy enough to have solid planetary defense forces. Others did not have the wealth for such things, however, and usually had to cough up whatever raiders demanded of them or be killed, or enslaved. Sometimes that happened too. Naturally, to make things run more smoothly in the Outer Rim, eventually some organizations rose to prominence to ensure commerce flowed smoothly and people's business dealings wouldn't be interrupted by Hondo Onaka every 5 minutes. Organizations like the Trade Federation. Early on, they were pretty good things, actually helping with free trade and keeping at least some areas safe from piracy. Of course, in order to keep people safe, you need something to fend off pirates with. So these organizations, and we'll focus primarily on the Trade Federation for now, built themselves some battleships. When others like the Techno Unit got involved with the Trade Federation, they started building themselves battle droids. Eventually, and with some prodding from good old Chivi Palparini, they had a realization. They had more military power than the entirety of the Republic. Time to blockade Naboo! Corporate interests, the machinations of the Sith, and people being fed up with an increasingly corrupt Republic ensured that come 22 BBY, the separatist movement of the thousands of planets that either joined outright or were swiftly conquered declare war on the Republic. And the Republic, flat out, was not ready for this. No real army, and the clones don't count because the Republic didn't know it was getting that. A navy that either didn't exist or did but might as well not have for the purposes of an intergalactic war, and a plan early on of praying that the Jedi could magic away their enemies until those first two problems were addressed. Whatever planetary defense forces the Republic had were quickly cobbled together into the refounded, centralized Republic Navy as it was officially reformed, and early on to say things were a mess was an understatement. Because the Republic Navy's existence before now was apparently an open question based on what you're reading, and because various worlds had defense forces and fleets of varying quality, ships and officers varied highly. Sometimes a Republic admiral would be highly competent, well-trained, and experienced in at least the concept of space warfare, especially those who might come from the Outer Rim. Admiral Yularen is a fine example of this, though no doubt it helps that he was next to Anakin half the time and therefore probably had some plot armor rubbing off on him. Other times, however, you either had some dude who was in charge because there was literally no one else piloting a ship that hadn't seen proper use since the Old Republic, or alternatively, you got Captain Nepo Baby from Coruscant who wanted to bravely charge headfirst into a separatist fleet alone. Well, it certainly helped that the Kaminoans, in addition to that whole clone trooper thing, also had a sizable number of Acclamator-class ships constructed alongside the ground army. The Republic still needed to kick production into high gear very quickly. Mace Windu mentioned at one point how even after Geonosis, the separatist navy still outnumbered the Republic by at least 4-1, and while lightsabers turn battle droids into metal sashimi, it's a lot harder to do that to a Providence-class ship. A few factors did keep them in the game, however. One is that the Jedi were frequently just that good. The Force guiding them and the expertise of those like Anakin and Obi-Wan meant that the Republic, for all it had problems, still had fine leaders in the Navy. And some of those fine leaders were space wizards, as much as I was poking fun at them being able to cut down a capital ship with a laser sword. While the Jedi Order immediately taking to the military so well is a big part of the downfall of them and the Republic, in terms of helping the Navy out, it did good work. I mean, be serious, who else but someone like Anakin was gonna come up with the idea to put ATTEs on asteroids for a space battle? You got someone like that on your side, you can get some insane wins when you need them the most. The second factor is that since the Republic is a galaxy-wide entity, it was able to throw the entirety of all that entails into the newly refounded and centralized naval structure. Early on in the war after the big opening act of Geonosis, a lot of the conflict was small-scale raids and skirmishes. The Separatists had a bigger navy, of course, but even then the Republic was far larger than the Separatist holdings were. It had a lot of territory to try and take, and in turn any Republic strikes could be focused on the smaller amount of CIS-held worlds. Even then, the war kind of snuck up on everyone as much as it was inevitable thanks to Palpatine's machinations. Some battles early on were fought without a droid or clone on the field, and the issue of manpower, or ship power as it were, extended to the navies on both sides, with each of them ramping up production massively to make sure they could win. The Republic simply had more raw resources, and the core worlds were of course far richer than anywhere else. Early on, raids into the core worlds and larger invasions, such as Operation Dirge's Lance, caused no small amount of problems for the Republic and the Navy, with that latter one in particular basically being General Grievous dragging his cyborg nuts across the face of every planet in his way. But as the war went on, the Republic's infrastructure became more and more devoted to the war effort, and at least in space, the numerical advantage was no longer overwhelmingly in favor of the Separatists. In spite of that, it wasn't an easy climb to an inevitable victory. The shortage of ships early on meant that even for smaller-scale ships, like corvettes, the Republic was desperately asking any random civilian organization to borrow their ships for the war. It was temporary that was a measure, but it's usually not a good look when you need to ask someone to turn their yacht into a destroyer. This also wasn't exclusive to the Republic. Lucrehulks, the big ringed droid ball ship, were repurposed cargo haulers essentially, but it was worse for the Republic than it was the Separatists. As the gap narrowed, however, the Republic was finally able to more properly go on the offensive towards the end of the war, and the Navy of course spearheaded that. The Outer Rim sieges was the Republic finally gearing up to take on the Separatists in the areas of the galaxy they held the most sway and power in. After early defeats and costly victories such as the Malevolous campaign, the funny ship that turns off your ship Grievous had for a bit, it was time to change things. Many large-scale assaults into the Outer Rim were launched, with the focus being attacking worlds that held droid factories. Initially it was largely successful, and in spite of Separatist Admiral Trench attempting to launch an attack on Republic shipyards, many droid factories and the planets that held them fell to the Republic's might. Not everything was a decisive victory, however, and the Outer Rim sieges, though the final major offensive and field of the war, turned into one last meat grinder for the Navy and Army alike. General Grievous responded to the Republic's invasion with his own counteroffensive, one that expertly took advantage of how stretched out the Republic's forces were. Even with the massive increase in military, and of course all the fancy new ships that created, the Republic more or less looked at the entirety of the Outer Rim and said put 'em up. They were stretched thin. Additionally, some planets were also simply miserable battlefronts that seemed to never end. Megiddo, the planet where Ki-Adi-Mundi gets killed on in Revenge of the Sith? That specific battle was the 4th Battle of Megiddo. Space Leningrad is real, and it really sucked to be deployed there. Even if it was the case that the Navy wasn't needed on a forever warfront similar to Megiddo, the troops there would need supplies, and those supplies have to come from ships, keeping them tied up from engaging on other fronts. The largest naval battle, however, is something you're no doubt familiar with. We've all seen Revenge of the Sith, don't pretend you haven't. The third and final act of the Outer Rim sieges was the kidnapping of Chancellor Palpatine in the Battle of Coruscant, where if you were looking up from the ground, you'd see battleships blotting out the stars themselves. And while for the battle there were all the Jedi that were on Coruscant, and all the admirals and commander and whoever else might have been around, I'll level with you. I don't think there were actual tactics being displayed by anyone on Coruscant. Every ship was for themselves, and you just gotta start blasting seppies whenever more of them show up in front of you. A Venator blows up a Munificent and is then blown up by a Providence before an Acclamator crashes into the Providence. And then Count Dooku got his head cut off and it was time to abandon ship. It was one big mess of a battle, and while it was ultimately a Republic victory and one that crippled the remaining Separatist forces, it wasn't a clean one. Ships in Star Wars sink to the planet after they blow up, right? Well, both sides of the war had thousands of ships fighting above the planet. Coruscant is one big city. Put 2 and 2 together and you get a whole lot of miles-long starships bulldozing through apartment complexes. Another hindrance was the quality of those defensive forces in the core worlds. The forces defending Coruscant weren't low in number, it was a good few hundred capital ships alone, but they were outnumbered and the fleets over Coruscant especially were not experienced. The Navy was organized into 20 major fleets, with 6 of them held in reserve in the core worlds. While they were rotated in and out to keep soldiers in the field fresh, many of these naval crewmen in the core fleets were untrained still. All the battles tended to be in the mid and outer rim, with maybe the occasional raid into the core worlds, but never Coruscant, not in any meaningful way. And then General Grievous himself shows up with what seems to be the entirety of the Separatist Navy, and some poor admiral was probably shitting his pants when he realized that that was the invisible hand that just warped out of hyperspace. No one really remembers that, by the way, that General Grievous is also incredibly smart as a commander, and not just a Jedi juicer. After this, the Republic Navy would spend the remaining short time of the Clone Wars fighting what was left of the droid army, most spectacularly of which was of course the final hunt for General Grievous. With Kenobi leading the charge, the Navy descended upon Utapau, and the final leader worth the damn in the Confederacy was slain. Order 66 happens, most Jedi die, the clones are discarded, and what was the Republic Navy is now the Imperial Navy, which I won't be going into here. Those are the original pieces of Doom, but I prefer the Venator of Doom. That, and in the name of being brutally honest with you, post-Empire lore for both Legends and canon doesn't really interest me all that much. Not that canon post-Empire lore interests many people nowadays.
They fly now!
The Katana fleet did show back up in Legends though. Since the Empire was shattered into remnants and the New Republic wasn't exactly full of industry yet, a bunch of people started a race to grab what was left of a fleet of old but fully functional dreadnoughts. I think Thrawn got most of them. That's about it. Now, as much as this video is an excuse to talk about ships I think are cool, Star Wars is the original setting, where there's about a different ships, weapons, and more that are all fully fleshed out, functional in the setting, and almost no one gives a damn. This is the universe that gave us Glup Shido, after all. So instead of getting too into the weeds on things, because I will be here for 3 years straight before I begin running out of random fighters alone, I'll just give you the big hits. As a spoiler alert, the alternate name for this section is, they gave how much fucking money to Kuat Drive Yards? Because those bastards are responsible for so much of what I'll be bringing up here. Starting off small, we have the ARC 170, probably my favorite fighter in all of Star Wars. Its name being short for Aggressive Reconnaissance, these things live up to their name. It has a hyperdrive mounted on it. In fact, not only is it a hyperdrive, it's a class 1.5 hyperdrive, which means this fighter is one of the better ones available in Star Wars. The 2 medium lasers it has for main armaments are, relative to their size, far more powerful than most other equivalent ships would have, being able to punch holes in capital ships if the shields are down and with enough sustained firepower. It could carry a few proton torpedoes as well as act as a bomber in a pinch, and the armor was solid enough with added deflector shields to give it some survivability. It also carried on itself not only an extensive sensor array, but 5 days worth of provisions for the pilot, co-pilot, and tail gunner, and the astromech that could be included, but those don't need food. It was created and introduced into the galaxy shortly before the Clone Wars, though it was intended as a direct counter to the Vulture droids that would indeed become its main opponent in the stars. In fact, I'd say the reason this thing didn't resoundingly beat out Vultures every time is because droids don't need to worry about G-force, and Battlefront 2 matches aside, every Separatist ship was its own droid. ARC pilots had to worry about their brains getting squeezed out of their heads if they turned a bit too hard. Droids have no such issues. Still though, the Clone Wars saw this multi-purpose ship become specialized for warfare, something you may have noticed since it does almost everything ever on top of being good in a fight. It also has the honor of being made by the Incom Corporation and the Sublights Product Corporation, making it one of the few things here that Kuat Drive Yards don't have their grubby hands in. Seriously, you think Palpatine was orchestrating things? I'd bet good credits that the Kuat Board of Directors was pulling his strings so that they could make the galaxy's largest profit from the Clone Wars and later the Empire. Speaking of, post-war the ARC 170 would still see some service, so it was gradually phased out in favor of ships like the oh-so-iconic TIE Fighter, though the Rebel Alliance would still grab themselves a few out of whatever mothball yards they could find some in. For more specifically bombers, however, we have the BTL Y-Wing. You know this thing, the Rebels used it plenty, but it was developed for the Clone Wars. Made by Cohen Sayer Manufacturing, it sure is a bomber. Carries a hell of a payload, slower than fighters, but to its credit, still surprisingly nimble for a bomber. Many a clone pilot wreaked havoc on Seppi ships piloting one of these, just as surely as many a clone pilot got spaced when he didn't watch his 6 and 3 tri-droids gunned him down. Let's move up in scale a bit more now though, shall we? As awesome as fighters are, I want my massive sci-fi warships that fight like we're in a Pirates of the Caribbean movie, but we should still build up a bit and not jump to the big boys immediately. So with that in mind, the Arquitane's class light cruiser. Fairly lightly armored given its smaller size, it nonetheless had 4 quad laser batteries for dealing with fighters, 4 turbo laser batteries for heavier ships, and 4 missile tubes if some extra punch was needed. Though technically called a cruiser, it was in fact explicitly an escort class ship, which while less impressive, anyone who's played Empire at War knows damn well those things are vital. You ever get swarmed by Y-Wings or TIE bombers and only have capital ships in that game? Your only recourse is to sadly watch as thousands upon thousands of credits go down the drain as proton torpedoes render your navy into slag. Ships like the Arquitanes are what allowed the capital ships to engage in their climactic space battles and deserve their due credit. Of course, none of that is actually why I'm mentioning this ship. Nothing I said was a lie, and I believe all of it, but I really care about the Arquitanes because there was an episode where General Grievous boarded one. That's it. You see, there he is fighting Obi-Wan. Any ship General Grievous has been on automatically becomes at least an 8 out of 10 ship. It's as simple as that. On that note about Empire of War, though, I have to at least mention the CR series of corvettes. You know what those are, because CR stands for Corellian, and in Star Wars, the Corellian Engineering Corporation is one of the only organizations that has a hope of approaching Kuat Drive Yard's level of starship manufacturing. They were fast as hell, lightly armored, and while for now they're a Republic corvette and therefore oftentimes great for dealing with things like vulture droids and other small craft, everyone used these things. The Empire did, the Rebels did, the Hutts and Mandalorians did. I don't think the Separatists did, because apparently the only people the CEC weren't selling to were Dooku and Wat Tambor, but everyone else had at least a few of these things kicking around. But now is about the time to finally get into the meat and potatoes, the kind of ships that you begin building in a Clone Wars era Empire at War mod, not because they're what you need, but because they have such unmatched fun and design and everything that you can't help yourself. And of course, we begin with the Acclamator series. Requisitioned by the Kaminoans before the Clone Wars began, we have another ship that's not developed by Kuat Drive Yards again. It was instead developed by Rothana Heavy Engineering, who are a subsidiary of Kuat Drive Yards. Another 20 trillion credits to the Drive Yards, baby, let's go. The Acclamator was not only an amazing vessel, it also set the template for what the oh-so-iconic Imperial Star Destroyer would be in many ways. The Acclamator was a capital ship of the Republic Navy, and so was at least partially designed to withstand heavy space combat. But to paraphrase the Kaminoans, they created the finest army the galaxy had ever seen. They weren't going to have it ferried around in anything but the best transports. The Acclamator indeed was designed primarily for transporting the clone army across the galaxy, and being sturdy and tough enough to fend off the threats that they would face doing that. Weapons first, but I'll talk about how insane this thing is with transporting soon enough. With a Class 0.6 hyperdrive, this thing is one of the fastest ships in the galaxy, with only highly specialized and modified ships like the Millennium Falcon beating it out. It had thick Durasteel armor and shielding as well to ensure it didn't crack easily, and for armaments it wasn't lacking anything. 12 quad turbo laser batteries could punch through damn near anything short of a Providence or Lucre Hulk, and with enough Acclamators that'd be no problem either. 24-point defense lasers ensured anything from fighters to missiles could be dealt with, and the 4 heavy missile pods allowed for the launching of either proton torpedoes or assault concussion missiles to ensure whatever you're firing at is sent straight to hell. All of this would run you just under 30 million credits for a single Acclamator, but when you're paying for quality, Kuat Drive Yards is going to ensure you get a quality ship, and that naturally runs up the cost. Or Rothana Heavy Industries ensures it, pardon me, for all that it's just Kuat under a new name. It could hold over 300 speeder bikes, nearly 100 LAATs to vomit a good chunk of those clones onto the battlefield immediately, dozens of pieces of artillery, and of course 4 dozen ATTEs. Incidentally, do you know what company made the ATTE? Do you take a guess? Yeah, it was Kuat Drive Yards. You will not escape the reach of Kuat Drive Yards. The Acclamator was a one-size-fits-all ship, and in all fairness to it, it did that job incredibly well. While it would eventually be put out of service, and by the time of the Empire it was considered a relic, the ship served valiantly during the Clone Wars and was one of the Republic's most effective weapons. Without it, transporting the massive clone army would have been damn near impossible, and as late as the Battle of Coruscant, it was holding the line against all Seppies who attempted to bring it low. Even with a lot of the early Clone Wars being low-scale engagements, without the ability to transport even small number of clones, there are no Clone Wars. And it was small scale for an entire galactic war. A small engagement is still a planetary invasion. Be it scouting, a proper attack force, or swapping out some of the ground vehicles for fighter support, the Acclamator could do it all. There was also the Acclamator II, which had much of its transport capacity traded out in favor of more weaponry. The primary usage of these things was orbital bombardment, since the Republic, even before it became the Empire, sometimes glassed a few planets. This iteration of the vessel did hang around a little longer, but was really only used in defensive capabilities by the Empire. A quick shout-out should also be made to the Victory-class Star Destroyer. While the Acclamator and Venator were what I believed at any rate to be the intended predecessors of the Imperial one, out of universe, the Victory just looked like a smaller version of an Imperial Star Destroyer. Technically classified as a heavy cruiser, it was still nonetheless a powerful ship with a large amount of lasers, turbo lasers, as well as a huge amount of missiles it could throw at the opponents. It was the kind of thing to punch above its weight class, and with a Class 1 hyperdrive, it was still a decently fast ship for where it was needed. But well, the issues it faced were twofold. The first is that it was only 2 million less credits than a Venator at 57 million credits, which while it did have comparable weaponry to that ship, it didn't have nearly the transport capability. If you're going to be spending basically the same thing between the two ships, you might as well spend the extra 2 million in favor of getting a whole lot extra usage out of a ship as opposed to a pure gunboat. I love me an Unga Bunga brick, but if I can have one of those that doubles as a way to swarm an enemy in fighters and bombers, I'm taking that option with a slight price increase it entails. entails. The second issue is that the Victory 1 version was plagued with technical difficulties. If it needed repairs, it would be dry docked for so long that the next 3 battles it could have attended otherwise would already be done with, which is a rough start, but that's nothing compared to the actual technical difficulties. Sometimes the hyperdrive would just fall out of its couplings. If this happened at hyperspace, congratulations, you've lost your ship and everyone on it. Other times, it would electrocute sleeping crew members. Do you want to be a crew member on the HMS Shock Therapy? Because I don't. I believe the Victory 2 did fix some of these issues, but it was never produced in as much numbers as the Victory 1, even by the Empire. If that sounds stupid, consider the TIE fighters don't have life support systems. Hardly like the Empire gave a damn about the grunts it's throwing at people it didn't like. Much of the reason these things were kept around to begin with was because when the Rebel Alliance got into full swing, the Empire wanted all the capital ships it had to be kept in service, which ironically means that even the Empire was aware of how shit one of their big toys was and wanted it gone. But now it's time for the true sauce of the Republic Navy, the one and only Venator-class Star Destroyer. Kuat made it, not even gonna pretend otherwise, and this thing runs you almost 60 million credits, not by any means cheap. In return, you get a top-of-the-line capital ship to see you through damn near any engagement you can think of. With a Class 1 hyperdrive, it's a decent bit slower than an Acclamator, but by no means is it traveling at a bad pace. And if a Venator is deployed, you're going to a proper fight. Acclamators arriving in half the time Venators take just means they're likely to charge headfirst into a massive line of opposing ships and get picked off like fish in a barrel. The Venator may be slower, but I say that it's moving at the pace that befits a ship of its power. With a heavily armored hull and powerful deflector shields, it can weather any storm from an equivalent vessel. You can even see a bit of this during the Revenge of the Sith opening, since at least by my estimation, most of the Venators Anakin and Obi-Wan fly past were winning their engagements. Of course, in the 2D Clone Wars, a Providence-class ship jumps out of hyperspace and literally rams through a Venator, but at that point, you're just weaponizing physics. Hard to fault the Venator's arms and armor when another capital ship crashes through it. When it rocks up to a battle, it has 8 dual heavy turbo laser batteries, 2 medium ones, up to 64-point defense batteries, deck guns like in Revenge of the Sith, tractor beam projectors, and several proton torpedo tubes as well. It was coming to battle armed, dangerous, and ready to make any droid ships in its way pay a heavy price. It had enough firepower in its armaments to rival even that of the first few proper Imperial Star Destroyers produced, because as I said earlier, when you ask Kuat for quality, they're giving you quality. It could also divert power from the rest of its systems to the weapons, for when the captain of this thing wanted the target in front of them evaporated on the spot. It could even change how quickly it targets vessels that trade off between rapid fire at close range and highly accurate fire at range of several light minutes away from it. This thing could be at the distance the Earth is from the sun relative to you and still be hitting bullseyes. Dude, the Venator is so much aura and power. Its secondary role, meanwhile, was that of a carrier, because the only thing that can make a battleship better, aside from more guns, is being able to double as an aircraft carrier. With room for hundreds of ARC 170s and plenty of other ships aside, it could vomit out an entire formation of flyers on anything coming near it. Naturally, it could also, of course, hold plenty of transports for ground troops or vehicles in addition to the fighters, or in place of them if it was being repurposed for planetary assault. While it would serve excellently throughout the Clone Wars with minimal issue, the Empire would nevertheless decide to move on from it after some time. Not because it began performing worse, if anything, the early Empire used them to great effects in its campaign and efforts. Rather, the Empire wanted to distance itself from the image of the Republic Navy. In large part, this is because of the Tarkin Doctrine, ruling through utter fear and terror so that no one would ever think of rebelling. As a dual-carrier battleship hybrid, the Venator's room that held fighters and crew and all that jazz was room that people like Tarkin would much rather have filled with more imposing guns. And also, if it could be double the size of a Venator and filled with more guns and all that extra space too, that'd be great. Because of this, the Venator would fall out of service not long into the reign of the Galactic Empire, though plenty of high-ranking Imperials had them in their private fleets, and various other groups such as the Rebels would occasionally get their hands on one as well. It may have been a fairly old ship by the time of the Battle of Yavin, but it was still a damn fine one. It did still inspire the Empire to create their own version of it for when carrier battleship hybrids were the smart move. The Secutor. Imagine a Venator. Now imagine opening Photoshop, stretching the Venator out horizontally, and then saving the image. That's the Secutor. It's a Venator, but wider. And one final mention is due, something that unfortunately took prominence in the sequel trilogy, but actually has its origins in a previous iteration of the project during the Clone Wars, the Manticore-class Star Dreadnought. The version we see in Episode 8, before the stupid, if admittedly gorgeous-looking hyperspace jump annihilates it, is the the fourth iteration. The first and second were built by I'm not even gonna tell you who built this. You know damn well which company did. Don't lie to me. At 8,000 meters long, the original Venator 1 was designed for Kuat's home defense fleet. The Rusan Reformation's rules limited how well armed it could be, but by the time the Venator 2 was built, those rules were being used to wipe the ass of Kuat stockholders anyways. Obviously, less of them were produced than other Kuat ships, since this thing was an investment, but on the flip side, the Separatist response to this, at least I have to imagine, was to hope the Republic didn't have one of these in the area. Don't have much else to say on it, I just wanted to, if nothing else, redeem in my own head something in the sequels by imagining it filled with clones instead of First Order nonsense. And while that wasn't nearly all of it, that was me yapping about some of the broader scale stuff of the Republic Navy. Or, really, an excuse to talk about Venators. That was really all I wanted to do here, and I got to do it. Everything else was a bonus. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Venator to my Republic Navy, the coolest and most powerful fellas around, and you're really awesome and cool and cool. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Imagine getting laid on a Venator's bridge. I would immediately blow my head off after that. I wouldn't be topping anything like that in my life. Yeah, I am in desperate need of a girlfriend and down bad for science fiction ships. What about it? I'm proud of who I am, and who I am is someone who wants Toppy on a Venator's command deck.